thank you, Kyung-wha, for giving me this opportunity to address the Asian society. It was many years since I came here. I was then the Minister for Information and the Arts, and Mrs. Desai, at the time the President, had invited me to come see the small but very exquisite collection that the society has, with the possible intention of exhibiting some of that collection in Singapore. I've addressed the Asian Society in Hong Kong, but never here. It's a great privilege. I had a standing invitation from John Thornton and Chiang Hing-chi. That was before Kyung-wha became president. And I said yes, not expecting to take it up in the short term. But as it turned out, my daughter married an American Chinese. The wedding was last month, and in a few days' time, there'll be a wedding reception here in New York. And it's a long distance. I mean, traveling from Singapore to New York, I did not have to adjust my watch. It's exactly the same time, only 12 hours different. So I thought, well, since I'm here, I should maximize it. And I said, well, I have this invitation, so I should take the opportunity to launch my book. But my new son-in-law, before she married my daughter, had told my daughter that trying to launch 3 books is not a good idea. You should try to launch 1 condensed book. But condensing 3 books into 1, it's not easy. I can't remember whether it was Tom Sawyer who said, it's harder to write a short letter than a long letter. But I thought since this was an opportunity, so I made the effort. It was more difficult than I thought. So now I have an international edition for North America and for Europe, which I'm launching this evening and commending it to you. And as it also turned out, yesterday was the 40th anniversary of my marriage to my wife. And we went back. We went back to the church where we were married in Boston. And the chaplain in Harvard, who married us then, came back from retirement to say Mass for us. And this time, the presence of all our children. It was very moving, and to us, very in awe of the divine mercy, because these are not things that you can plan for. And when they happen, we are filled with a great sense of gratitude. Many years ago, I knew a Roman cardinal who was secretary to John Paul II. And he was drafting a speech for the Holy Father. In that speech, he said, for the gathering of bishops, that despite our diversity, we are one. The Holy Father wagged his finger, struck out because, despite, and wrote because. Because of our diversity, we are one. In other words, we are one only because we respect that each of us is unique, that each culture is unique, that each country is unique. If we want, as a condition of a relationship, that the other person should be like us, that's not a relationship. That's a dictatorship. And those who attempt procrastinate solutions end up committing great evil. And this problem we confront today, aplenty, partly caused by technology, partly caused by globalization, certainly aggravated by the social media, where we are taught to stereotype the other, to demonize the other, to hate. To a point where we refuse even to communicate, to concede that perhaps the other side has a point of view which is legitimate. This we see in international relations. This we see in our own societies. What we need is to respect differences, to respect that each of us has a separate evolution. At home, the mother will never treat the children equally. When one is sick, all attention is on the one who is sick. The father is a bit more of a capitalist, he calculates, it's more transactional, but the mother, no. The mother cares for everybody. In our society today, there is not enough of that feminine instinct to see each for what he is and to help that person, to interact with that person for what he or she is. Without being preachy, somehow this theme recurs in different parts of Musings. And it's not my intention to be a preacher, to be a missionary, because I was for many years in government and I was a foreign minister, trade minister, I had to negotiate, I had to deal with my counterparts from other countries, sometimes to resolve very difficult conflicts. And I was delighted that when my daughter got married in Singapore, many former foreign ministers from the region, from countries with which Singapore had difficult issues, came. And we recognized one another as old warriors who, despite the battles we fought, had in fact an affection for one another. So if we have this, that even though we're different, even though we may see in the other things that we dislike, we concede that that person may also see in us things he or she dislikes. But if we think of the positive aspects, there are so many things which should bind us together. And this, the world badly needs. And I think all of us, in our own little circles where we can, should build bridges rather than blow up bridges. The Asia Society was formed to build bridges across the Pacific, multifarious links which are precious, many of which are now being sundered, decoupled, disengaged, because of prejudices, because of fears. And if those of us who are appalled by what is happening do not, in our own ways, big or small, do our bit to build bridges, it will be a more dangerous, uglier world. When we come back, when my wife and I come back to New York to meet old friends, to celebrate how my youngest son was saved in St. Jude and how my wife was saved in MD Anderson in Houston, we realize how important these links are, not only in a geopolitical sense, but at a human level. Many of us come from families which straddle the Pacific and will be terribly hurt if the geopolitical conflicts that we see before us today get worse. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, George, for that rather philosophical opening to our discussion on a very real, geopolitically difficult issue of U.S.-China relations. And you've directly engaged with issues. You have observed this issue. You have commented on this issue for years, for decades. So let us continue the conversation. I think recently, I think we are seeing both sides trying to manage the competition. And the ambassador to China, Nick Burns, came here to say, there's no doubt about it, we are in a long-term strategic competition with China. And he also added, but the US has no intention of being number 2 in this competition, meaning they clearly want to win. That is a statement of a very tense relationship. And so managing things is one thing, but how do you then go beyond that management into a relationship that is more constructive, more reassuring for the world, more, as you say, that builds rather than seeks one-sided interest at the expense of the other? I think that's the kind of world that we want to see. How do we bring that about?
I watched that video in preparation for our event this evening. And that remark about the US not being number 2 troubled me the most, because it suggested that the US would do everything it could to prevent China from being number 1. And the Chinese ambassador to Washington of many years, Kang, after he retired, he went back to Beijing. I think it was the end of 2022. He gave a speech, scripted, where he said that there is no bottom line to the ill will which the US has for China. I was shocked by what he said, and I looked back at the video, and I saw him reading from a script. It was a prepared statement, and therefore in the Chinese system, approved in some way, a warning to the Chinese people to be prepared for the worst. If both sides continue along this path, I think there'll be great trouble. I think China is prepared to accept the US for what it is. It may have its wishes that the US is in secular decline, but if the US recovers, I think China is prepared to accept that it is a country with very special strength, to which the children of many of the leaders there would want to come to study, to do research, and to work. Mm-hmm. And perchance even to settle. They know that. What they do not want is for the US to want to somehow change China in its own image. To me, that's completely unrealistic. I mean, there are China scholars who have invested almost their life studying China. They love China so much, they want to change China. And when they find that China has not changed, that love turns to hatred. That cannot be the basis of love. That I love you because I can change you. That's the basis for trouble. Yeah. And China has its own deep nature because of its long history. There's no country which has a more recorded history of its own past than the Chinese. So it's deep, extensive codification. How do you change them? Even Xi Jinping can't change it. Mao Zedong, before he died, he said, in the end, I've only changed a few things in my own neighborhood. He launched a cultural revolution, wanting to change China, and he failed. Because it is, as a civilization, the most conservative in Chinese history, and which is why it has survived so long. So for the US to think that it can change China, that's an illusion. And if one builds hopes on an illusion, it can only lead to one outcome, to tragedy. But if the US accepts China for what it is, I don't think China wants to be number 1 politically. You'll be number 1 economically because of the size of its population. But it doesn't want to take on the burdens of being global hegemon, of being global policeman, of ensuring that the waterways are open, that there is a working international system. They'd be quite happy if the US were to do that. So if what the US seeks is not to bring China down or to prevent it from rising, but they say, look, in a multipolar world, in the end, we'll still be primus inter pares. We'll be the first among equals because of the English language, because of standards, because the US itself is a meta system, a pluribus unum, with diverse components, but held together in a constitutional republic. sustained by certain values of freedom and democracy. I think even the Chinese people admire that. They're not sure it can work. It certainly cannot work in China. But when they come to the US, you're a researcher, you're a taxi driver, you're a software programmer. Yeah, it's a working system, and I'm fairly treated.
George, I think the idea of the US trying to change China, I think that's whether that is the real intention is also debatable. But I think there are many things that China does as a matter of fact and behavior that the US and many other countries receive as going against their interest. So for example, recently this issue of Chinese overcapacity and that leading to the US 100% tariff on EVs and lesser ones on the supply chain. So leave aside the issue of the desire to change, but when faced with something that China does that is seen as damaging the national interest, these kinds of reaction then come from the United States, and of course that then leads to greater distrust and mutual finger pointing. And I think also the South China Sea is a very sensitive area where we hear daily news of China's so-called gray zone maneuvers in these sensitive areas. So there are facts happening that makes it very difficult to have a generous understanding. And also I think China doesn't explain itself very well beyond such eloquent speakers like yourself.
Well, in terms of overcapacity, I think the problem is Chinese competitiveness in certain sectors of manufacturing. It has always been the case that when China is at peace and organized, it is the most productive economy on earth. Take, say, Chinese pottery. When in every dynasty, when they are at peace, they outproduce everybody. And naturally, others feel threatened. And indeed, the industries are threatened. So when British cotton and fabrics became so competitive, and India had to import them, it completely decimated the local Indian textile and fabric industry. If India were independent and autonomous, it would have blocked the importation of British textiles, but they could not. So I see the reaction of America and Europe to Chinese competitiveness as natural. And perhaps it's not possible to avoid trade negotiations and manage trade. So if you allow the free importation of Chinese EVs, then eventually you'll lose the industry. But if you protect, you're imposing a cost on your own consumers. Will the time it buys you enables you to catch up on productivity? If you cannot, then you should shift position, because there's a cost involved in buying that time. When I was trade minister, I gave a speech once that the juggernaut is coming down the expressway. If you stand in front of it, that's not very wise. But if you move aside and catch the draft, you'll be pulled along. So you need more careful strategizing. If you're only responding to the pain felt by ordinary people and reacting first order, the result will be greater pain later. So in the case of Singapore, we are too small to be price makers in the world. We are price takers. So we adjust. In this area, I cannot compete. So instead of competing with you, you become a factor input, a cheap factor input to what I want to export. Then I gain from your competitiveness. Yeah. And there has to be this more subtle, deeper, longer-term thinking. But very difficult in a democracy that survives from one election to another. Because all the time you're facing pressure from the ground, and your responses are short-term rather than long-term. Chinese competitiveness in the end relies upon a very large internal market and a very hardworking population. I mean, they work on weekends. I mean, it's infecting Singapore now. There's a term, TGIT. Instead of thank God it's Friday, it's becoming thank God it's Thursday. Well, why not TGIW? I mean, well, you can do what you want with yourself, but in the end, you've got to compete in the global marketplace. Well, keep out the world. Okay? Then where will you be in 20 years' time, 50 years' time? You'll be nowhere. That's what happened to the Qing dynasty, right? They kept out. They told Lord McCartney, 1793, the Qianlong emperor, there's nothing you have that we are interested in. There's nothing we can learn from you. Go home. And the result was a precipitous decline. And this is now a challenging period in Western society because the system prevents longer-term strategizing. It's not that people are not aware of the problems, are not capable of the analysis, but they're constantly having to respond to short-term electoral pressures.
Well, I think from the climate change activist point of view, they want all of those EV not tariffed, but bought and distributed through the world so that the world as a whole will have something to show for our fight against climate change. But I think you make the point that as governments, there is certainly a need for strategizing and subtle policy implementation to protect, in the end, your industries as well.
I can talk about the South China Sea if you wish, but...
I know, I've read your book.
Yes.
I know you have a very different view of the whole situation, and I've learned a great deal. I think that China never signed up for arbitrary...
compulsive
and had to, and therefore could not accept the decision that came out, and the history surrounding the 9 dots. It's in there, but I want to move on to Taiwan because that is the most important, to put it mildly, issue between the United States and China. Taiwan had a inauguration of a new president. His inaugural statement didn't indicate any policy changes, but the rhetoric certainly could cause discomfort in Beijing, and Beijing responded with a very heavy military exercise. But I think the sense is that the leadership in Beijing is waiting things out to see what happens in the next US presidential elections. I think many are on many fronts. So I think the risks are being managed, if I could put it that way, in this period. Well, how do you read the situation? How would you like to see the situation evolving before and after?
In the short term, I don't see war because the US doesn't want war over Taiwan. Whether there's war over Taiwan really depends on the US. China has made its position very clear. Kissinger spoke about it repeatedly, that when he dealt with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, they kept on coming back to Taiwan. So the moment the US departs, de facto or de jure, from a one China position, that's a red line for China. And the US knows that when it moves towards that red line, the Chinese bark louder. When they retreat, the Chinese quieten down. So the US knows that there is a red line. And when Lai Ching-te won the presidential elections, the US sent 2 retired officials, Steve Hadley and Jim Steinberg, to Taipei. And they met Lai Ching-te, they met Zhu Lilun of KMT and Ke Wen-tze with a simple message: no Taiwan independence. And they flew home. So that was very clear. Without US underwriting Taiwan independence, it's futile. Lai Ching-te is darker green than Tsai Ing-wen, so he cannot betray his own ground. So he's got to say certain things. The Chinese response is very predictable. Every time you move beyond an earlier position, we tighten the cordon, we tighten the noose. It's a ratchet. The next tightening will be from that position. So when Pelosi visited Taiwan, they exercised closer to Taiwan. This time around, after Lexington's speech, they move even closer. The Taiwanese know this. So you play this game, the noose tightens further. Can you win? You cannot win. Would the Taiwanese fight like Ukrainians? They will not. They will say it to themselves and they will say it to foreigners they are comfortable with. Of course, the US would love to fight China down to the last Taiwanese, and the Taiwanese would like to fight China down to the last American. But neither would do so for the other. So, in the end, you've got to find a way to look after ordinary Taiwanese. Because if you don't, the DPP will be wiped out in the next election. And this time around, they don't control the legislative assembly. They need to work with the other two political parties. Now, China takes comfort in the fact that 60% of Taiwanese voted against the DPP and therefore voted against independence. So they like to think. But among young Taiwanese, the percentage is much lower. And they know that. Which means that if China doesn't work to engage even the DPP, the lighter green parts of the DPP, I think the problems in the future will be trickier. And using force to solve this problem is suboptimal. They cannot give up force, because if they give up force, then there will never be unification. And the Americans and other countries would want to be a division between China and Taiwan forever, if they could contrive it. That's what they wish. China won't allow that, so we say, okay, there should be a gradual convergence, and they will try to delay it for as long as possible. So this is a game being played. The tail end of a long Chinese civil war, which has been peaceful. Hopefully it will be peaceful. But if it is kept open, then one day it will lead to grief. But I don't see Lexington having a lot of room to play.
Well, let cool heads prevail. So I think getting into the election leaves all of us in the conundrum. So I will not get into that discussion. But speaking of ASEAN, we see a difference in the ASEAN reaction to the situation in Taiwan. So, as I remember, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, I think, after the election in Taiwan, reiterated their support for the One China policy without any mention of the election. And then Singapore and Philippines, I think, congratulated the victor in the election. So there's differences. And I think we all want peace and stability, but how you then verbalize that into a response to what goes in Taiwan is a bit different and diverse, even among ASEAN. So let's talk about ASEAN.
I don't think any ASEAN country wants to get involved in the Taiwan conflict, not even the Philippines. There's no profit there. In the case of Singapore, we have a special relationship because our soldiers trained there from the time of Jiang Jingguo. Lee Kuan Yew made it clear to Jiang Jingguo that one day when Singapore recognized China, the ROC flag, ROC state crest will have to come down. So when we recognized China and all these things happened, there was no surprise. And China knew that we have a special relationship with Taiwan, which if we play it carefully is advantageous to China. So the Wangku talks took place in Singapore in 1993, and Xi Jinping, in a remarkable gesture, met Ma Ying-jeou as an equal in Singapore in 2015. So Singapore's position is unique. It is not a position which any other country can easily take. In the case of the Philippines, because of the current conflict over the second Thomas show, or Renai Jiao, there's a little cat and mouse game being played. It can lead to accidents. Someone lost a finger yesterday, I think. But it's really childish. I mean, what's happening? The Americans are egging the Filipinos on, but at the same time telling them, don't start a war. I think eventually good sense will prevail, and some way by which each accommodates the other will be found. We don't need an additional conflict in our region. And no one wants it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I can certainly say that about another potential flashpoint in my part of the world, and you've been a keen observer of that part, the Korean Peninsula and the North Korean issue. So I think we do have time to probe that issue a little bit, but I think President Putin is visiting North Korea as we speak on his first visit back to North Korea in 24 years. He visited in 2000. This clearly demonstrates the relationship between North Korea and Russia becoming much more closer than it used to be prior to the war in Ukraine. I think the war in Ukraine has been an opportunity for North Korea out from its diplomatic isolation. Big concern there from the United States and South Korea, certainly. And I think China also would be watching this with a great deal of wariness. There's this tendency to lump China, Russia, and North Korea together. Then U.S., Japan, and Japan together as the two sides on this new Cold War in Northeast Asia. I think China's position on looking at what's going on between Russia and North Korea is much more complicated and nuanced than that. How do you think China would be looking at this, rapprochement between North Korea and Russia?
China has cleverly inserted itself and triangulated for itself a very comfortable position where all sides need its support and cooperation. In 2009, when I visited North Korea as a foreign minister, I brought my wife along. It was very sad. Many windows were broken, covered with plastic sheets. And they get very cold winters up there, And I heard later that the Chinese donated a glass factory. After I left government, 10 years later, 2019, I visited North Korea again. Despite sanctions, Pyongyang looked much better. And again, I went down south to the DMZ, and the countryside was much improved. So despite sanctions, North Korea has been able to sustain itself, build up its nuclear capabilities, ICBM capability, and largely help body and soul together with a great sense of dignity. South Korea has 30,000 American GIs. North Korea will not countenance even one single soldier from the PLA, only dead ones in the cemetery. So these are very determined people. And now with the Ukraine war, Russia has decided not to be part of, not to allow the continuation of a UN agency to police sanctions. North Korea today has escaped. They will now work with Russia, and that's why Putin is in North Korea. So North Korea, Iran today will benefit from what has happened in Ukraine. And they can no longer be confined. And even when they were confined, they still managed to make remarkable progress. So a way must be found to talk, to reduce tension, to gradually take small steps towards peace. It's very tragic, the Korean people. Not unlike the Germans, who were the aggressor during the Second World War. and therefore divided. North Korea was a victim before the end of the Second World War and remained divided till today. And China's position is they have a right to be reunited. So Deng Xiaoping took this position, summarized in the usual Chinese way. If the South invades the North, China will support the North. If the North invades the South, China will not be involved. But not to oppose it, because unification of the Korea is a right of the Korean people. That's their belief. And their ambassador in Pyongyang is always senior to the ambassador in Seoul. In fact, their ambassador in Pyongyang always comes from the International Liaison Department of the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, they're very intimate links with South Korea, with which they have a very strong economic relationship. And when South Korea allowed the American to deploy air defense radars for the THAAD system, they punished South Korea. And in the end, South Korea had to adjust its position. So they keep their links to North and South Korea, to Russia, managing their relations with America and with Japan. So China is in fact playing a very skillful game, in my opinion.
Well, I could go on and on, but I think we're already over our due time. But I have to go to your book, give you some minutes to talk about your book, and I have a signed copy here. I have to say it's been one of the most enjoyable readings that I've come across recently, really full of gems of knowledge and insight. But just to end our conversation on your book, there's so much in this, but of all the things that this book shows that you've been involved in and engaged in, so of all the musings that you've did, what would you count as your most proud moment? And on the one hand, and on the other hand, what would you say remains a point of regret or a point that clearly sees failure?
I'm philosophically a Taoist. I'm a Roman Catholic, but philosophically very inclined to the Taoist view that we are part of larger flows. If we succeed, it's because the flow is aligned with what we do. So we succeed. If we fail, it is because we're misaligned. So I tend not to be too elated when I succeed, nor too despondent when I fail. The key for me is understanding the larger flow and moving with it. In the case of Myanmar, on which I spent a great deal of time, when I first met Aung San Suu Kyi after I had left government, I told her, Dorsu, I'm so happy to meet you. I spent so much time talking about you, and I'm meeting you for the first time. And it's a privilege. And to see what has since happened is heartbreaking. I don't blame myself or Singapore, because the country is trapped in a very difficult situation. But we should all at least try to be peacemakers and not be troublemakers. So it fills me with pain, but at the same time, I understand that it will take time. And it's not entirely a bad thing that in Myanmar today, no party, not the government, not the NUG, not the ethnic military organization, no one can win completely. If the center breaks, the country will dissolve into civil war for years to come. I don't think it will. There will be a kind of a no war, no peace, live and let live situation. And the fever will not go away, but if we bring the fever, keep the fever manageable, that's good enough. And let time heal the body politic gradually. So Myanmar fills me with a certain sorrow. Our relationship with Malaysia has improved a lot. One issue which bedeviled us was something quite obscure, which was a railway line from Malaysia running to Singapore, owned by Malaysia, which prevented us from level crossings in many parts. There was an agreement between Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew which was never implemented. And the ground was so poisoned, it was difficult to find a solution. But when there was a change of prime ministership in Malaysia, and I had to deal with a new foreign minister, I decided to make an effort. In the end, I had a breakthrough. I can't take credit for it because the ground had shifted, and I was able now to move when in the past I could not. But still, it's nice. And if you give me some credit for it, I'll happily accept.
Thank you. Thank you so much, George. I think I was going to ask you about Myanmar, and Myanmar is a painful point for me as well, having worked on that file in my UN days, both on the humanitarian and the human rights front. The ground is shifting there as well. Over the past couple of months, the dynamics on the ground have shifted mostly in favor of the militias. But yes, it's not going to switch overnight. It's not going to be back to peace and democracy overnight. So, but we shall pray and hope the best under very difficult circumstances. But I have to give the opportunity to our audience for a few questions and comments to George. We're about 10 minutes beyond our time, but I will take us to about 7:10. And then close this conversation. So could I see any hands? Way back there, young lady. Yes.
Hi, Minister Yo. Thank you so much for this talk. My friend Sam is here visiting from Singapore, and I grew up there, so we're very happy to have you here at Asia Society. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the U.S.'s positioning of itself as a protector of human rights in Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole. Ambassador Burns came here a couple weeks ago and spoke a lot about how the U.S. Contradicts itself in relation to China with regards to human rights. ASEAN states, Singapore specifically, how do you see the U.S. in that sense now? Do you think they're being hypocritical? Do you think that their positioning is changing? Would love to hear you elaborate upon this. Thank you.
The US is a bundle. There's a side of the US which is hegemonic, which likely uses force to achieve political aims. I once told an American friend, he was somewhat troubled when I told him that. I said, "You are warlike people. At the drop of a hat, you move military forces," which is true historically. But at the same time, all of us who have spent time in America know how generous the American people are. When my youngest son had leukemia, he was fortunate enough to be treated at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which is perhaps the biggest charity in America. We didn't have to pay a cent because we didn't have insurance. We didn't want parents to decide on treatment modalities on the basis of cost, because it is a research hospital. And at church, the hat was passed around and a few $100 pressed into my wife's hand, even though we did not need the money. But this is the generosity of ordinary Americans. When we were in Houston, where my wife was treated at MD Anderson, she's a pianist, and at various corners there are pianos, all donated by well-wishers. A little trolley serving coffee, tea, cookies, run by volunteers. This is America. So it is a bundle. There's a part of America which we all love, and there's a part of America which we all fear. And how American society evolves is for Americans to decide. We can't change America, we can't change China, but we watch with anxiety what's happening in this country.
Young gentleman.
Hi, Mr. Yo. My name is Cyril. It's a great honor to hear from you today. In your extended musings, I think musings 3, you talk about a story where because the then Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, visited Taiwan, right? The Chinese were a little offended, and to the point that when Lee Kuan Yew passed away, they sent someone of, I guess, not a senior ranking official to Lee Kuan Yew's funeral. My question to you is, over a thorny issue like Taiwan, right? To pick your point, to what extent do we think China will break one day and kind of watch what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and decide one day that peace is best served through strength?
To what extent?
To what extent do you think China is watching the Ukraine situation and saying, eventually military strength is what matters, especially over a topic that is so close to the Chinese heart, over Taiwan?
Every Chinese knows the dynamics of three kingdoms. Many of you would have read The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And if for the US, the main challenge is China, then the US should move close to Russia and combine with Russia against China. So the fact that the US and Russia have become mortal enemies is a gift to China. Of course, China is very careful to triangulate this position and not be too much in Russia's camp. I think they are about 55-45, with a bit more weight on Russia than on the West. And it's a comfortable position for them to be in. Sometimes they're 60-40, but I think right now 55-45. And if there's a possibility of peace, they'll move towards 52-48. But it'll never be 50-50, because they know that if Russia goes down, all the pressure will be on them. They can't say it, but it's obvious their strategic thinking. Gaza is another gift to China, because these for them are distant wars, and it takes away unwelcome attention by the Americans of them in East Asia. And it'll be prolonged. In the end, some kind of a partition of Ukraine is inevitable, like the partition of the Korean Peninsula. It can go on for decades. There'll be peace. One part will join the EU, like Cyprus, like what happened to Cyprus. But there'll be no peace agreement. And for as long as there's no peace agreement, there'll be continuing antagonism between the West and Russia, which means that the relationship between Russia and China will be close for decades to come. So this is a new phase in history.
Thank you. Certainly the sudden outbreak of the war in Ukraine has almost like thrown a monkey wrench into the global politics and changed the calculations on all sides. And you say that has been, for China, it has given them breathing space in this competition with the United States. Yes, the gentleman on the side to the left. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. So my friends in China have been very well educated friends in China. They're generally fairly pessimistic based on the trend over the last 10 years. So I'm curious about your perspective on China for the next 20 years or so, and also on China-US relationship.
Organically, China will continue to grow because it's still got a lot of slack to take up. Eventually, it has to confront demographic decline and ossification of its system. Ossification in China means corruption, or it's expressed in corruption. It was getting from bad to worse until Xi Jinping took over the leadership. And when he said that unless the problem of corruption was tackled, both China and the Communist Party had no future, people did not believe him. They thought it was just rhetoric. But the manner in which he moved first against public security, the Zhou Yongkang, Lin Zihua group, Bo Xilai group, and having resolved that, turned around to clean up the PLA, and more recently the Communist Party Youth League. No one believed he could have done that. So the trend towards greater corruption in China, which we saw during the Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao years, was reversed. And that has given new hope to China. But of course, it also means centralized rule. Many people worry about centralized rule in China, worry about key man risk. The irony is this, that if there is no centralized rule in China, if there are factions, then corruption is inevitable. In China, to get around corruption, you have to centralize. But of course, within that central system, sub-factions are now evolving. So this is the dynamic of Chinese society. Every dynasty goes through this progression. China will eventually, but I don't think in the near future. Right now, they're producing more STEM graduates than the rest of the world combined. They are very hardworking people, very high savers. And in many areas, they are formidable. Yes, at the frontier of science, you can't match America. But what they're now saying is, yes, from 0 to 1, you'll be America. But from 1 to 100, it'll be China. Elon Musk has repeatedly hinted about this. He said, design is not difficult. The manufacturing is difficult. In other words, to throw up new ideas, perhaps America has the most fertile ground. But to carry it to fruition across time and space, China may have an advantage in certain industries, India and others. So yes, I know right now there's pessimism in China because of the pricking of the real estate bubble, youth unemployment, a sense that the bureaucracy has become rigid because everyone is afraid. A friend of mine said, when I was at a meeting in Beijing, he said the Beijing is very tense. My reply to him was, since when was the imperial capital not tense? But this is China. And this drama we cannot affect. And it's very difficult for individual Chinese to affect that drama.
Just to tag on to that question. So you think with the continuation of collective leadership at the very top, this fight against corruption would not have succeeded?
No, if there were factions like you had in the earlier period, you can never fight corruption because each would favor its own loyalists. And you can never take away corruption from Chinese society because it's embedded in Confucian relationships. You know, from Qing dynasty to Han dynasty, the great change was the idea of Li. Li as in Li Mao as in Li Wu. Li. Ritual, behavior, to organize large numbers. So during the Tang dynasty, they lost it, and then Han came around and said, no, stop this religious nonsense, worshipping Buddha bones and so on. Go back to Confucius. Song dynasty, again, go back to Confucius. And today in China, they're going back to Confucius because it's such a vast country. The idea that you have a constitutional republic where the emperor can be questioned, can be litigated. You cannot run Chinese society like that. Just as you cannot run Western society like China. So when the Chinese people say, look at the West today, look at their parliaments, they are abusing one another, how can it work? I think this is a long tradition going back to the days of the Roman Republic, of Cicero, of Catiline. This has always been the West. The British Parliament. Why do they have a sergeant at arms? Why is it before you pass a bill, the doors are locked, bolted? Because sometime in the past, people broke in as votes were taken to influence the vote. The sergeant at arms carried today a ceremonial mace. It was once a weapon to bludgeon you if you interfere in proceedings. So each of us is a prisoner of our own history. You can't change Islamic society and say, look, depart from the Quran. You will fail. The West will be the West and the East will be the East. Will they meet? Yes, they will meet. And in some ways, they meet in America. As a meta system, which was the original liberal idea. But today, the liberal idea has become doctrinaire, has become ideological. But if we can recover that liberal idea of accepting differences and finding commonalities in our differences, then we will have a working meta system which can bring hope to the world.
A working meta system. Yes. On the fourth row there.
Thank you so much for I don't know if this is working or not. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming and speaking to us while you're here. You mentioned that there are certain behaviors that can't be changed in Chinese society. You also talked about how maybe we shouldn't be in the business of trying to change China. However, there's certain behaviors that China does that many Americans would perceive as deal breakers, backstabbing potentially. Theft of intellectual property, things like the unequal desire to hack us and embed future solutions that may destroy our infrastructure. So if you were America, how would you approach these behaviors? Would you try to change them, or would you try to somehow maneuver around them? Thank you.
Intellectual property is a problem which resolves itself because China has become a major producer of intellectual property in the world. And it's become in China's interest to protect intellectual property. And it's improved a lot from previous years. At the beginning, of course, they will copy, they will make do, but which all developing countries do. It was not surprising. I remember when I was Minister for Information and the Arts, and Disney figures were being parroted in China. When I visited Disney, I said, look, well, they're building your future market. And indeed it did, because now Disney is able to exact full royalties because of intellectual property protection in China itself. So it's improved a lot. It's improved a lot. I think it's a receding problem. It's not a growing problem. The other issue of, I think what you're suggesting is intelligence gathering through embedded devices, the internet, and so on. I think all countries do that. Probably the US more than any other country. It's a spy versus spy game. I mean, in a small way, when I was in the Singapore Armed Forces, I had some understanding of this game. It will never go away for as long as we have nation states. It can be managed. It should never get out of hand. If we allow in any country for intelligence to drive policy, you have a problem. You take, say, 5G. The US took a position to kill Huawei. In the latest Economist, they wrote their long piece on Huawei, how the US has failed to kill Huawei, and has in fact made it stronger. Well, if you say, I want to deny the Chinese a capability to prevent me from doing what I've always done, which is to access everybody's system, then I'm denying Western society also. So today, 5G in the US and Europe is way below 5G in China. So real industry is being affected. When intelligence drives policy, policy is suboptimal. But policy cannot ignore intelligence consideration. So I was in the Army, I was in the Air Force, I was in the Defense Ministry. Then I went over to become Minister for Trade and Industry. I went over to Foreign Affairs. So I see it from both sides. You have to strike a balance between your capabilities and your immunological system. If you have an overwrought immunological system, in the end, you hurt yourself. But this is the phase the West is going through.
Thank you. Clearly, it's such a clear way of doing government work in these very challenging times, where you have information, false, fake, intelligence, secret, and it's very difficult to work with all of that and make this policy decisions that is in your self-interest, sensible, but also promotes a situation where it's not just your interest, but the interest of the larger cause beyond you. And I think, George, your many years, over 20 decades in public service has been exactly that. And we have so much, the current generation of leadership has so much to learn from you. I've learned a great deal reading your book, listening to you. I'm sure we all did. So thank you for being here with us. And now